So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am the head of School of Policy here at CU, and I teach economics. And the one thing I teach the students early on is that there are opportunity costs to things. And today the opportunity costs are very high because there's so much going on surrounding CU, academic freedom. So this is the first thing I want to do is to express deep appreciation that you're coming to what is our core business, what is our core intellectual work, which is that we want to discuss research, we want to discuss policy, and we should stick with this. And I'm glad that so many of you have chosen these meetings. This is a School of Policy event. It's a public lecture of Professor László Andor, whom I'm very delighted to welcome here today. László is the head of the Department of Economics of Economic Policy at Corvinus University in Budapest and senior fellow at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies in Brussels. He was, everybody knows, of course, László, because he was the EU Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion in 2010-2014. Since 2015, he's been lecturing at the Harty School of Governance and several other universities in Europe and elsewhere, worked with several think tanks. He's a policy fellow at IZA, which is my former place, so that's another connection. And he is Doctor Honoris Causa at Sofia University, and he's received Legion of Honor by the French President in 2014. László, I'm very delighted that you accepted our invitation. The talk will be on the European Convergence Challenge, Efficiency, Solidarity and Competitiveness, and I'm especially pleased to be in touch with and collaborate with László on these topics because László is this unique intellectual who's been a commissioner, who's been right in the middle of the kitchen of public policy, but at the same time he's a professor, so he's been doing research and he's pushing this agenda, very important agenda in Europe. The talk will be followed by a panel discussion, and I'm very pleased to announce two distinguished panelists along with László. Professor Andrea Weber from the Department of Economics and Business, and Marco Leonardi, who is a professor at the University of Milano and also advisor to the former advisor to former Prime Minister of Italy, Matteo Renzi. So we have a fantastic setup to today, and I invite László to the floor and to give his lecture.
Dear Professor Kahanes, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first of all I would like to thank for this opportunity to lecture at the Central European University in Budapest, and I hope that the CEU can continue its remarkable academic activities also in the future. I think this opportunity today is highly relevant and very strongly connected with the policy debates in the European Union institutions. And when we discussed with Martin how the focus of this event, the lecture and the panel debates should be developed, indeed the idea was to select a topic which is very interesting for research, but also is something that can be found at the heart of the EU policy debate. And convergence is clearly a critical concept. It has been a critical concept in Hungary in the last 25 years. The whole process of a transition in the 1990s, but then the accession to the European Union had the concept of upward convergence in the focus. If there was one main purpose of this transformation, economic, social and political transformation in the East, it has been the idea to converge on West European standards, whether it is income level or other aspects of life. And today, there are indeed many different types of discussions about convergence. I have to say that rightly in the European institutions, this is not a one-dimensional discussion, but at least two-dimensional. And there are many open questions. Just very recently, a few weeks ago I attended a workshop by one of the Brussels think tanks called CEPS, and there was quite a heated discussion about the concept, the necessity, and the tools of convergence in the European Union, with many open questions. Let me just highlight a few. One important point to be highlighted is the difference between diversity and divergence. Of course, the European Union, 28 nations, is a very diverse system. It can't be, by definition, it can't be homogeneous. And how exactly we should expect convergence to happen, while at the same time we respect and sometimes even celebrate diversity, is an important question. Then, if we want to insist on convergence and also measure it, of course we have to find the relevant units. What exactly is the unit that needs to converge on an EU average or on another unit? Is it the member states? We now have 28, soon probably 27. But still the member states are the key components of the European Union. Or is it groups of the member states, like core and periphery, or Visegrad group, or the Nordic countries? What should be the unit of the analysis, and how many different types of cores and peripheries might be defined in the European context? Or should we go subnational and take the so-called NUTS 2 regions? Definitely in larger countries like Germany or Italy, it is probably a must to go subnational. But maybe it's also relevant for medium-sized countries like Hungary or Slovakia. And then a next question is, especially for measuring, the quantitative question, how to measure. Is it just about the GDP, or do we also need to go beyond the GDP and look at a variety of other indicators? This also reminds me an act from 5 years ago, 2013, when probably the first time in the history of the European Commission, we adopted a communication about the social dimension of the Economic and Monetary Union, and introduced a scoreboard of indicators, not GDP, but unemployment, relative poverty, income inequality, and so on and so forth, in order to use these more social indicators when we want to answer the question whether there is convergence or divergence among the EU member states. In this particular case, these indicators were measured on member states and not subnational units. But there is also a qualitative aspect. It's not only about measuring specific indicators, it's also about the assessment of what kind of society, what kind of economy, what model of capitalism is developing in one part of the country, one part of the EU or another. Is it the case that the transition countries of the East, by joining the European Union, will converge on one of the capitalist models of Western Europe, one of the welfare models of Western Europe, or it's going to be a different type or even a different class of market economy as compared to the West? We cannot rule that out, neither ex ante nor ex post, with the experience behind. As I already pointed to this, the final question is that if we detect, and we will see this, the asymmetries and imbalances between core and periphery, we will have to see that it's not only one type of peripherization, but there are at least two dimensions here, the north-south and the east-west. What concerns the east-west, which is probably more interesting for us today, the key question is how countries and regions with a very uneven development level can function in an integrated single market. So the single market is going to be the key question, and the fact that an income gap and the productivity gap continues to exist between the major regions. And why, if we look at another dimension, the north-south divide and imbalance, then we will see that the key question is how surplus countries and deficit countries coexist in a monetary union, which is a not very well developed, but relatively underdeveloped monetary union as it was designed at the time of the Maastricht Treaty. So there is a long list of questions, and I'm not promising you an answer to all these questions and methodological and conceptual challenges, but I would like to analyze together with you here how exactly the East-West asymmetry is working out, in what sense we can speak about convergence or the lack of it. We should also have a look at the North-South problem and then compare the two. And when we compare, we also need to have at least a few ideas about what policy needs to do. Right? There is a job for the academia to study what is going on and to find the key facts and trends, but this is also an issue for policy. Why is it an issue for policy? Because these are not only intellectual questions, it's actually in the treaty of the European Union that convergence must happen. It must be observed. These are a few quotes from the Treaty on the European Union and the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, when you can see, for example, that the closer coordination of economic policies must happen for a sustained convergence of economic performances between the member states. When we say economic performances, it will translate to GDP, but the expectation to deliver convergence and cohesion is further defined in other chapters and also in secondary law, and it is connected with a broad objective of economic, social, as well as territorial cohesion. And this is, in a way, the legal basis for a variety of policy initiatives in the European Union, which we have been working on in the recent decades. Now, the question is how we go from diversity to convergence when we have to start by the recognition of great regional diversity and even imbalances in the EU. If we start with the GDP, because according to the treaty we have to focus on economic performance, we have to start by recognizing the great diversity of the European Union countries and regions. On this particular map, what you can see is the uneven level of income, of regional income, as measured in GDP per capita. Right? It's not that hard to notice that there is clearly an imbalance between the East, which is portrayed by yellowish and lighter colors, and the West, where you find the blue countries and regions, and the darker it is, the richer the particular region, the NUTS2 region, which is on the map, where probably one of the darkest blue is Norway, which is not an EU member, but since Norway is also part of the single market, it has been also included in this analysis. But the point is that in general we have an impression about the East-West imbalance in GDP per capita terms. And the question is whether there is a tendency in the European Union to overcome this divide, to overcome this asymmetry. Is economic convergence happening if we first focus on GDP per head? If we focus on GDP per head, we will see that if convergence is happening between East and West, it's probably happening very, very slowly. You can see the EU average somewhere here, this bold black line, and with these other lines of various colors, you will see the GDP per head of various regions of the European Union. Regions means country groups like Northern Europe and at the bottom, two groups of the eastern member states, and the bolder red is, let's say, the Visegrad plus, the Visegrad countries plus Slovenia, and the pinkish line is the more peripheral, either Balkans or Baltic countries of the European Union. So probably it can be observed from a distance that the growth of the per capita income of this region is somewhat steadier than the growth of the EU average, especially the recent years, the last few years. And if there is a problem in a particular region with the GDP per capita growth, that's not so much the new member states, the East, but this is a group of countries which you can see with this blue line, practically the Eurozone periphery. But let's continue focusing first on the East-West question. The East-West question also can be analyzed through a more detailed year-by-year statistics of GDP per capita dynamics, showing that in a way there is some convergence between the East and West. Here we break down the East and the West, East to two categories, just like in the previous one, and compare the per capita GDP level to the EU average. And we find that in the mid-1990s, when these countries were applying for EU membership, the GDP per head, let's say the Visegrad Plus group, stood at about minus 70% as compared to the European Union average. And then by the 2010s, let's say by after 10 years EU membership, it came close to minus 60, but didn't even reach minus 60. So there is some convergence of GDP per capita, but it's not a massive convergence, and it's even less impressive if you look at the south or periphery, right? The Balkans and the Baltic group of the eastern member states. So GDP convergence is happening in a very, very slow pace. There are further indicators to highlight the discrepancies. Wage levels, including the minimum wage, almost self-evidently demonstrate these big discrepancies. This is a comparison of minimum wage in purchasing power parity, and you can see the Benelux countries and France on the left with the highest minimum wages, and Romania, Bulgaria on the right with the lowest ones. Of course, the cost of living is not identical. So if you do not use purchasing power parity, but if you use another type of comparison of minimum wages, which is how the minimum wage compares to the average wage, we still find a very important divide, which practically means that the minimum wage as a tool is less effectively used in the Eastern member states to provide some kind of stability for incomes and income growth. So if the question is whether economic convergence as measured in GDP is also coupled with social convergence as measured in incomes, in this case the primary income, then we already can observe the first very important divide that also hints to a divergence of the social models that includes different models of wage setting and wage bargaining between the East and the West. This is even better illustrated by this chart, which demonstrates the wage share in manufacturing industry. Not in all Eastern Europe, but in the Visegrad countries. Again, if we take the period of pre-accession and the first decade of EU membership, what we can see is that in Western Europe, which is the EU 15, this blue bold line, the wage share in manufacturing industry can be sometimes volatile, but it's more or less steady. It's more or less steady at the level of 70%. While in the East, there are clear periods of fall. This is, for example, Hungary here, this red line, but this is even more striking fall in the case of Poland, which is revealing the high probability of low wages and lower wage shares being not just an unfortunate outcome, but clearly a policy for cost competitiveness, which, while these falls, in a way, a decoupling of Central Europe from Western Europe in terms of the wage share was developing, facilitated a reindustrialization through transnational investment in this region. So Central and Eastern Europe, and primarily the Visegrad countries, became reindustrialized in this period, and maintaining, so to speak, competitive wages has been one of the key strategies at that period. But this is not without a consequence, right? So this allows this region to maintain a higher share of manufacturing in GDP as compared to Western Europe. But if low wages and weak labor power is a tool to achieve this, then there will be consequences. The most important consequence is the outflow of labor. Right? So if the policy eventually reproduces the wage gap and doesn't allow wages to grow as fast as GDP per capita would be growing, this is a factor massively contributing to the significant flows of the workforce from the East to the West. Make no mistake, the wage cannot be seen as the only factor behind labor mobility. Right? There are many so-called push factors on the side of the countries of origin of large-scale population movements, and there are certainly very significant pull factors as well on the other side. But if you look at it in a kind of structural analysis, then the wage gap is clearly a major issue. Expectations about wage growth, or the lack of it, of course, also can trigger significant population movement. This chart speaks about, again, the first decade of EU membership for these countries, and even less for Romania and Bulgaria. But you already see that in this first period, about 10% or even more of the active workforce managed to leave countries like Romania and Lithuania. And since this is the first decade and not the most recent period, Hungary here is still seen with a relatively modest participation in intra-EU labor mobility. Since 2011, this has been a lot more intense, and a more fresh data would certainly portray Hungary somewhere closer to the average of the eastern countries, and not at the lower end. And then we come to counting the further consequences of low wages and high outward mobility, because as the data shows, this process increasingly affects the highly skilled population. If we look at the share of those with a tertiary education among the mobile workforce, then you will see that it has been an increasing tendency. In other words, at the very beginning, from most countries, it's the relatively lower skilled or the medium skilled tended to leave and take advantage of the free movement in the European Union. But as time was passing, and perhaps especially when the financial and economic crisis, fiscal adjustment, and many other factors stepped in, the highly skilled people, the more highly skilled people, started to participate more intensively and came close to being overrepresented also in the recent period. So in some cases, their share, the share of those with a university or college degree was already high. This applies particularly to Lithuania and Estonia, but other countries were also catching up with in terms of the mobility of those with a university or college degree. And the point I want to make is that according to the data about participation in tertiary education, it seems that this region is not really reproducing those in higher education. Right? So the participation in tertiary education in the East is significantly lower than in the West. Of course, there are also exceptions in the West. So it's not true that all Western countries would have significantly higher participation in higher education. You have, for example, here Italy, which doesn't seem to be stronger in this context than, for example, Czechia or Poland. But in the East, there are also countries like Romania here, which seems to be even below the average of the Eastern countries regarding tertiary education. So if there is no policy or capacity to reproduce highly skilled people, while highly skilled people are increasingly involved in outward mobility and look for jobs and find jobs elsewhere in Europe, then this probably, in the long run, progressively undermines the growth potential of these countries and the capacity to increase productivity in the long run, which might signal that this group of countries might eventually just be stuck in a specific type of economic growth based on foreign direct investment and the low wage strategies which have been linked to that. But there is always a silver lining. Some people say the silver lining is that those working abroad, especially if they are more highly skilled, they can send home a part of their salary Yes, this is partly true. This is part of the reality. Nevertheless, if you also factor in that about 50% of those who go to work from the east to west experience over a qualification. In other words, they find jobs which would require a lower level of training and qualification. Then it's not simply a brain drain, but it's also a brain loss for Europe as a whole. A very interesting phenomenon in the labor market. And then finally, from the East-West analysis, all this works out also very negatively on demography. What you can see here on the top line, this is population growth for the European Union as a whole, and we know that this modest population growth for the European Union as a whole only happens because of immigration to the European Union from non-European countries. Now, the eastern countries, starting with Hungary, Estonia, Romania and others, experience much less immigration, either by intention or just because of the circumstances, being less attractive, and shorter life expectancy as well, higher mortality, which means that there is a major imbalance in terms of population trends between the East and the West. And I think for many people this is a very serious issue that can be politicized. In a way, it's quite surprising that it's not politicized more than the dynamics which you can see on these charts. In terms of long-term implication, just to give another type of comparison between the East and the West, this is a comparison between the East and the West in terms of the speed of the railways. And just to demonstrate that in most of the Western countries, you already have very high-speed railways reaching 300 kilometers per hour, not every time, but occasionally, which is 3 times more than much of the railways in the eastern member states of the European Union, and Germany and the central regions are somewhere in between. This is just a hint to the fact that the GDP in 1 year does not necessarily speak about these longer-term developmental aspirations. That if you want to catch up from a lower level of development, obviously you want to catch up in many different aspects of the economy and life, and the quality and the speed of travel is, of course, also one of the aspects which give people a possibility of comparison, and this is certainly something which would take a very, very long time to overcome because of the need to invest very large sums if you want to achieve the transport standards of Western Europe. Now, as I said, the East-West question is something which people are aware of. People are aware of the convergence as measured in GDP growth, because the Eastern countries have demonstrated their growth potential by having consistently higher GDP growth rates than the EU average, especially the Eurozone average. But as I mentioned, in the recent years, when convergence and divergence is discussed in the EU context, the key concerns is not the East-West asymmetry, but the North-South. I will be much briefer on that in order to stop before we go interactive. If we want to look at the tendencies and the gravity of the North-South imbalance, there is no indicator that would be better than unemployment. On this one, when the next two regions are colored according to the level of unemployment, there is no East-West divide. Certainly there are some regions with great difficulties in the east as well, but the regions with tremendous hardship and difficulty can be found in the south of Europe. Don't forget, this is data from 2012 at the time of the Eurozone crisis, when Spain and Greece experienced unemployment levels for several years at the range of 25–26%. Now, if you want to see divergence as opposed to convergence, you have to look at the unemployment trends between the core and the periphery of the Eurozone at the time of the Eurozone crisis. And there you find this. Here is the Eurozone periphery, mainly the southern European countries, not exclusively, but mainly. And here is the Eurozone core, Germany, Netherlands, Austria, and a few others, which practically do not feel much on their labor market out of the Eurozone, crisis, as opposed to the pre-crisis period, when there was no major difference between these regions at all. So, to put it very simply, the incapacity of the Economic and Monetary Union to deal with a financial crisis, namely financial fragmentation, at the time of a crisis, results in these major divergence, in a way decoupling, and if unemployment takes this direction for several years consistently, obviously the social and political consequences are also massive. What you have seen in recent years is practically a crisis of governability in several countries of southern Europe, if not all. Perhaps Malta is an exception. It's not only the unemployment trend, but also the employment trend, which is a matter of concern in the south. These southern European crises, for a very long time before the crisis, were converging in terms of the level of unemployment with the European average, but then a turnaround was happening in 2008 and 2009, and the divergence is massive. So you can compare the blue line, which is Eurozone periphery, with the red and the pink, which is the East. The East remains convergent in terms of the employment level with the West. So even if there are crises in these countries as well, you understand from this graph why it is a much smaller concern for the EU as a whole than the divergence, which you can see here, measured in terms of the employment level of the southern European countries. So, to sum up, we have an East-West asymmetry, which in economic terms, in GDP terms, demonstrates a lot of convergence. It's sustained and sustainable for a long time. It's in the pre-crisis period, it was linked to very symmetrical flows of capital and labor, because capital has been moving from the west to east and created subordinated positions of the eastern players, while we also saw the massive labor outflows and the demographic decline. In the post-crisis period, we saw Central and Eastern Europe performing better than the Eurozone, but we also have been witnessing signs of political degeneration and also questions of this model of economic development. So, what needs or what can be done in an EU policy context, and what the EU can, in a way, incentivize in these countries? A shopping list can be seen here, with issues like more social investment and innovation, more inclusive labor markets, improving the industrial relations and the social dialogue, including wage bargaining, managing the EU labour migration better in order to avoid, for example, these massive cases of overqualification, and more importantly, improving the EU capacity to help all this. And there is an EU tool to help all this. Let's not forget the so-called cohesion policy. It's one of the biggest envelopes in the European Union budget, and the question is whether a cohesion policy can be adjusted or reformed in a way to support better convergence, not only in terms of the GDP per capita, but also all the other indicators which speak about the sustainability, including the social sustainability. You probably know about the key tools of convergence policy. What I want to highlight is that there is a lot of thinking at the time of planning the next EU budget about how to improve. There are quite a few proposals on the table. First of all, to prevent and stamp out abuse of the EU funds, which undermine the capacity to deliver on their mandate. For example, creating an EU prosecutor and introducing a rule of law conditionality to avoid abuse and misuse of the EU funds is something which is being discussed. There's always a lot of talk about simplification of the regulation to make EU funds accessible to the stakeholders who would need to use it. And there is always some talk, maybe this is less prominent than it should be, about the policy content. What kind of policies would need to be supported by EU funds, how to connect regional policy with more innovation in industrial policy to help boosting productivity in all underdeveloped regions. There is a tricky chapter, which is financial engineering. Financial engineering practically means that you have to either combine EU resources with other forms of finance, or you have to repay a part of it, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a transfer in a one-way fashion, but some kind of revolving fund which also educates the beneficiaries of EU support to develop better skills to access the banking system and the financial markets as well, and reduce dependency on transfers. Changing co-financing rates is also one of the current proposals. If it happens, it would by definition increase national ownership over the policies and the programs which are supported by the EU. Now, this is about an existing fiscal capacity, which is a fiscal capacity in the EU budget, which needs to be improved, but at least we can say that this exists. What doesn't exist is a fiscal capacity for the monetary union. Right? The EU has structural funds to help overcoming these structural asymmetries, which now we mainly analyze in the East-West context. But what the EU doesn't have is cyclical funds to help countries and regions coming out of a cyclical recession and dealing with cyclical unemployment. For this, some kind of EMU fiscal capacity would be needed, on the top of many other measures that need to help the functioning of the Eurozone improving and becoming more resilient, let's say. Financial sector regulation, probably a very important one. But the critical discussion is how the monetary union could also get a fiscal capacity which the single market of the European Union already has. Maybe I should leave this just with highlighting what is on the table, because after many, many, many years of speculation and very theoretical discussions about fiscal capacity, eventually the European Commission has put on the table some tools embedded in the EU budget which would serve cyclical stabilization from the EU budget, and then help dealing with those cyclical movements of employment, unemployment, and GDP, which we saw previously on the charts. The two instruments which are being discussed following the proposal of the Commission is a so-called investment stabilization function and a so-called reform support program. We can discuss whether these are really effective tools or not. I just want to highlight that in the academic literature, and sometimes in the political debates as well, there are many, many more proposals. There's also already been a Commission proposal on creating a Eurozone finance minister, which would be able to conduct more symmetrical adjustment, for example, in the euro area. And the Commission also has conducted several studies about automatic fiscal stabilizers, where, as we know, unemployment insurance is a possibility. At this moment, this is not an EU proposal, but several leading figures, the latest being the German Finance Minister Olaf Scholz, have already made proposals about unemployment insurance, which is one possible form of the automatic stabilizers. So in principle, there are many, many ideas. Occasionally, there are also concrete policy proposals as well. The question which can be discussed is to what extent these policy tools can live up to the challenge of asymmetries, imbalances and divergence in the East-West and the North-South context of the European Union. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now I invite László, you please, and Andrea and Marco, if you could sit. Let's see where we are. Okay, so please check. Thank you very much, László. This not only informs us about where we stand, but also outlines some policy approaches. When I looked at one of your maps, I was wondering, I got a bit skeptical actually, and the reason was that we talk about East-West convergence, but then you look at South-North convergence in Italy, you look at East Germany, West Germany, you look at some other regions, Catalonia versus the rest, and you say, well, all the automatic stability, all the instruments are in principle there, all the fiscal capacity, but still entrenched inequalities or different levels of development. And how do you see this in the context? Is there some kind of should we remain skeptical like this, or is there a way forward, and maybe we should see some examples of actually positive developments in those contexts as well?
Well, I think the imbalances inside specific countries is a different matter, because Germany may have internal imbalance between the East and the West, but Germany is a fiscal union. So if there is an asymmetric shock, which the country can experience, it's not going to lead to a collapse of the economy and the collapse of the living standards in one or another part of the country, because demand is sustained, the welfare system equally functions in all parts of the country. And the same applies to other countries. The welfare system is much weaker in Italy, but still it provides a stable base which has an economic as well as social function. The second point is that mobility can play a greater role inside a nation state because of the common language and the common institutions, like having a national employment service, for example, inside Germany. This is not the case in the European Union. Of course, the European Union also has tools to help labor mobility, but still we are divided by 24 official languages and a few more unofficial languages, and the European labor market is not as transparent as a national labor market can be because of language and the employment service. So nation states can have imbalances within themselves, but still they have a lot more tools to stabilize the situation as compared to the European Union, which therefore requires more solidarity.
Right, so one could imagine this as sort of there are two things going on. One is existing inequalities, and we could try to manage them, but well, maybe there are limits to this. But then there are institutions and policies which actually may compensate those, so that the cohesion is
maintained. Yes.
Yes, Marco, Italian experience. Do you agree or disagree, or what is your take on this?
I agree that Italy during the past 50 years has not been able to reduce substantially the difference between the north and the south. So there is still a very big divide. And actually even the internal instruments, so the public policy instruments that are proper to a single country have a lot of trouble in making convergence happen within countries. But this may be a specific problem of Italy, because Germany over the last 20 years did better, even if probably Andrea knows more than me, even if it's still not complete convergence. So Spain did better, but still there is a lot of differences. But it's absolutely true that these are two different problems. And actually, I wanted to add one element to Andor talk. I believe that we must make a difference between countries which have the euro currency and countries that do not. We must, because optimal monetary areas have some specific rules which we always neglected, and require a degree of convergence and of parallel trends in growth of GDP, of inflation, of interest rates that are completely different from countries that are not in the same monetary union. So to your argument, I would add the point that I think we need two-speed Europe, because otherwise, two-speed in this sense. So we need to build the things that you said at the end, the Investment Stabilization Fund, the Reform Support Fund, Eurozone Finance Minister, European Unemployment Insurance Mechanism. I agree, we need a step forward, because otherwise we go backwards. So that there are two ways, as always. Staying still, it's probably impossible, because it's like a bicycle. You cannot stay still, especially now. Europe is in trouble now. If we stay still, we fall down. So there are two ways. Either we go forward or we go backward. And many countries are now pushed to go backward. But I think that the way to go forward is to reduce the complexity. So you cannot possibly build an unemployment insurance mechanism for all 27 countries. or you cannot build a reform fund for all 27 countries. Also because they not all need the same convergence mechanism. Euro countries with the euro currency need 2 or 3 steps forward. Other countries, I don't know, I know little less about other countries, but for sure those that have the single currency must move forward with something much more important in terms of fiscal space and fiscal convergent mechanism. Other countries probably have different problems. If you want to reach unanimity and keep 27 together, I think we lose the battle.
Andrea, how do you see this? You've been agreeing, disagreeing. What is I see you nodding and shaking hands, shaking heads. So.
Yeah, so I certainly agree that this is a very, very difficult question, and so that we cannot have one solution that fits all. So we have to go at the regional level and look at the problems in this perspective. So I'm a labor economist working a lot on Austrian labor market, and I recently started a project where we look at the effect of the Eastern enlargement of the European Union on the Austrian labor market. And so I looked at the predictions that were made before this happened, and then now compare this prediction with what we see in the data now. And so in the predictions, they were very, very worried by this imbalance in wage levels and in price levels between Austria and the Eastern European countries. So there is the wages in Austria are maybe 5 times higher than in the Eastern countries. And so the worry was that there was a huge inflow of immigrants coming into the Austrian labor market. So Austria as well as Germany, they opted at the time for a 7-year transition period, so from 2004 to 2007, the Austrian labor market was still restricted. And so what they also did, so they put in this restriction with 2 assumptions, and one assumption was that there would be convergence in between, so that this wage imbalance would reduce substantially. And the other assumption was that these migrants who really wanted to leave the Eastern European countries, they would go elsewhere, farther away from Austria. And if you wait for 7 years, the problem would be less severe than immediately. So what we see, what really happened is that this labor market restriction has worked well. So we see only a slight increase. Is also what László was showing of this migration from the east to Austria. But after 2011, with this opening of the border and the labor market, so the migration increased steadily. So the trend became much steeper. It's not that with a rush everybody came in, but it increased steadily. And what we also see is that these workers, they work in the border regions, so very close to the Austrian border, or they work in the Alps, where there is the tourism jobs. So this means that these are not permanent jobs, but these are temporary jobs. In the tourism sector, it's very seasonal, and also in the border regions, they probably commute back and forth a lot. So there is a lot of commuting going on, and it's not these workers who want to migrate to permanently relocate to a faraway country, but who want to stay living in, say, Hungary, and just work in Austria and then come back and consume the income in Hungary. So this means that also the price differences make a lot of difference. So if you can earn a high wage in euro in Austria, but you only have to pay living costs in Hungary, so you win on 2 sides. Right? So these are the real problems. And if we now look at the convergence in the wages and the price levels, there wasn't much. So there was initially there was a little bit of convergence, as also László showed, but with the crisis, this convergence more or less stopped, and we still have a 1-to-3 relationship in the wages between Austria and many of the Eastern European countries. So putting in this 7-year restriction or transition period didn't solve many of these problems as initially expected. So we just delayed the process to a later date. Yeah? So it means that this these policies that really have an effect, we still have to find them, and we still have to design them to stop the migration flow and the brain and experience drain from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, and also to get at this adjustment in the wage and price levels. Because if the wages are the same in Hungary and in Austria, there's less of a need to commute to Austria for work or something like this.
So commuting to Vienna might not be.
So I'm commuting the wrong direction anyway.
I'm also commuting the wrong direction. Yes. Let's see if there are questions. The audience. Do you need some more time to think about questions? Or in the meantime, while thinking about questions, I have one which is thinking about these inequalities across Europe, mechanisms that may possibly compensate, or stabilization mechanisms. There's this very simple question. We had with László, there was a conference in Bratislava with social partners, and what they ask is, but what should we tell these people? Yes, what should we tell the workers? The workers working in there's a multinational, yes, has a subsidiary in Košice or Debrecen or somewhere, and then there is a very similar factory in southern Germany. And why is it that these people earn much lower wages in northern Hungary or northeastern Hungary or somewhere? Yeah? And what kind of convergence do we imagine for them? Is there a deal? Can we offer them is there a deal we can offer? Is there something we can tell them? Like, look, you will never converge, forget about it. Or, well, convergence possibly, yes. Or, well, no convergence, but there is some kind of compensation. Or what is the message we could give these people?
Yes, the point is that wages do not grow as fast as productivity improves. So there is some kind of tendency to close the gap in productivity, but the weaker wage bargaining and the tendency to set the minimum wage lower as compared to the median wage results in much slower wage growth. In this country there was a wage hike pre-election, but then there's a lot of cutback after the elections in order to correct and fall back into the original scheme. So I think there are two directions. One of them is how to help the capacity of the social partners to be kind of able to negotiate more forcefully. And that's, of course, difficult if the level of organization is weaker on both sides, both the labor and the employers' side. There are less strength in this. The other one is to somehow try to coordinate the setting of the minimum wage. Of course, this is an area where the European Union does not have explicit competences. But still, you can start working on a methodology, how far it should be from the median wage, what should be the dynamics of the minimum wage adjustment if there is growth and productivity is improving and so on and so forth. So this is another possibility. Of course, many economists fear too rapid increases of the minimum wage, so it's also a frequent discussion in Hungary. But since the gap is not closing, since there is clearly a reserve, that should be a way forward.
Any reactions?
The multinationals, I think it's one of the big issues. Of course, it's an example of an already existing integration. Of course, if you work for a multinational, you're already on the lucky side of the coin, because of course multinationals usually have standards across countries. A most urgent and difficult problem is delocalization, so outsourcing, moving firms from one country to another. And there are still many issues. For example, I can tell you about some very important cases recently in Italy of big firms that still want to move to Eastern Europe because they have fiscal advantages. And of course, this causes a big upset of the government that loses the firms. So there must be more coordination also in the fiscal competition across countries. That's one thing that should work better across the single market. So there is little reason for making a difference between countries that use the euro currency and countries that don't. But it's still so there is no reason to make a difference between these two groups of countries. Instead, there should be common rules, because in most cases it's still very difficult to apply to the Commission for to claim that there was an infringement of the rules. So every country now it's free up to a certain point to offer the best opportunities in terms of fiscal rules for incoming firms. Of course, this is causing, in many countries still, in many cases, this is causing the relocation of firms from country to country. This is something. Of course, it's hard to manage.
There is no consensus on this, because there is no consensus on this, right? Like there are competing interests within East and West possibly on this, or?
No, that's East and West. That's more. That's why I said it's less than. It's less a problem of euro currency, rather it's a problem of East and West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Andrea, from the Austrian perspective,
from the Eastern perspective, I think what is important to think about is these infrastructure investments. If you looked at this map with the high-speed railways, so there is a lot of lack of infrastructure in the East, and if we were to have more railways or roads, then it would also be more attractive for the firms to settle in these areas. And the other thing is that there is really now, for instance, in Hungary, severe shortage of skilled labor in this area. So that even if we can drive there, there are no workers. So it would be necessary to attract high-skilled workers to these areas, and also the firms to revive the economic activity.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I'm a lawyer, I'm not an economist, and I was wondering what kind of tools you would have to, I think you had a slide but earlier, to manage labor mobility, because as a lawyer I also always think about legal rules or restrictions, but what are the tools available to basically move workers or move labor where it's best to be? So I fail to concretely understand how it works.
Well, the main tool is developing a public employment service. Of course, there are private agencies as well which try to connect supply and demand on the labor market. But the public employment services do have do play a very important role in terms of not only informing the potential employers and the potential employees about the opportunities, but also to connect them with the training opportunities, because very often it's not simply the geography which has to be sorted out, but the skill gap between the possibility of the employment. So some countries, like the Netherlands, for example, have very, very advanced employment services. And this is also one of the keys to low unemployment, and especially low youth unemployment in that country. To make the first step on the labor market after graduating or after leaving school is absolutely crucial. And Austria, Finland, have exemplary policies on this. The EU was making efforts to transfer these institutions, these solutions to other countries as well. And that, of course, also needs further EU funding. This funding needs to be maintained in the new budgetary cycle, and also these networks of cooperation between the employment services of various EU countries need to be maintained and further developed in order to ensure that the cross-border migration works out better, and specifically to avoid this overqualification, the brain loss, the skill loss, which sometimes takes place because the people just follow the good advice that the EU is there for you to find a job in Germany if you lost one in Spain, but it's not so automatic as it would seem to be in a textbook.
Any reactions?
I've seen a paper, a very recent paper of, I don't remember exactly, it was on the NBR working paper series. I think it belongs to a big conference, probably a European Commission project on labour mobility within Europe. And what they claim, so the point was the assessment of how much mobile, that's again, optimal currency areas are based on free mobility, in brackets, free mobility of labour and capital. If mobility of labour doesn't work, of course, at a certain point, the currency union is not anymore optimal. How good are we faring with respect to the US? That was the point. It's the point of the paper. Still very much behind. Of course, Italians don't move to Germany when there is an adverse shock to the Italian labour market. The difference is made only by immigrants. So it's immigration that adjusts and offsets the shocks. If you don't have immigration, you don't have basically labour mobility. That's the conclusion of this paper. So nationals, natives don't move. If you have immigrations from abroad, then you have something. And you see it also, for example, now in Italy, you see it. The population imbalance is such that you barely can pay the pensions. The number of natives, the population, the number of employed natives with respect to pensioners is shrinking. So there are less employed population, so not necessarily employment, but employees of course pay social security contributions, which pay the current pensioners. So if the population is shrinking, and it's predicted to be shrinking by 20% over the next 25 years, 20%, the bracket of the population 15 to 65, so the working age population, 20% native. So either you make up with some immigrants, or you have a problem with paying pensions. Or you have to rebalance, so not necessarily. If you don't want immigrants, no problem, you don't have immigrants, but you have to rebalance. Either you increase the social security contributions on employees, or you reduce the pensions of those that are pensioners, because the numbers are against you. The number of pensioners is increasing, the number of working age population is shrinking. I think this is not only an Italian issue.
Yes, please.
I'm not economist, but looking at the convergence and mobility of people and capital from east to west, I think that the solution all the time is putting on the social aspect. I saw in last month of presentation started first with the prosecutor of state legislation, of private and reform into the institutional setup. But I'm not seeing some regulations of the capital or revision of some rules of the capital. And one of the key aspects it is if the capital is moving from the western part to eastern part, it is exactly this that they are having gain in the eastern part, that it's the share between work, other taxation and what the capital is getting in the eastern, it's higher. So what we do with this? For the redistribution. The same it is with wages and moving population from east to west. It is that west it's gaining of having lower ages and this, but all the time they are showing the bad examples of what is visible, and media is working on that. So my point it is for you as economists, how we look to revisit the rules for the capital, not only for institutions, for states, and for citizens. So how the capital will be traced better in Europe, and how will be redistributed? Something like Thomas Piketty.
Thank you. Who wants to tackle the difficult question?
Well, I think someone has already mentioned taxation, and taxation is very central when you say that the same company can make much greater profit in some countries, which tends to be the eastern ones. So if, for example, Hungary is a tax haven for multinational companies, and there are additional gifts also to, I don't want to name the famous automotive producers in this country, then of course they like operating here and enjoy the benefits and transfer those to the headquarters. So again, this would require some kind of coordination of taxation. That's again something which in the European Union is considered to be a matter of subsidiarity, but somehow this would need to evolve if we want to avoid these massive imbalances in the single market. It's not an easy answer because these aspects have been set in the EU treaties, and the EU treaty says that tax is a national competence. There are of course other aspects of corporate functioning, but that was the first on my mind.
Yeah. The question is really going, in my view, at the center of some of these issues about convergence, because there is one question is how big is the pie, is how much is productivity and how much is produced, but then how is it divided? And then what's the intervention of the state to redistribute, and to what extent is this borne by labor or by capital? And the one important topic which I'm a bit missing. So there is some of the explanations why is labor kind of on the losing end of this is the capital is more mobile, or union membership is shrinking and that's the labor is weak, or maybe there is biased technological change which favors. But the one part of this debate is, in my view, missing a little bit, which is competition policy, where the size of profits depends on the concentration in the market. Yes, like if there is more monopoly power in the market, then profits are bigger, and this leads to a higher share of capital in the pie as profits go up. Do you see this connection? Is there, because there are these various ways how convergence can be achieved, and the one vector of divergence here is that the different division of the pie between east and west. One vehicle of convergence is productivity, the size of the pie, but then there's the division of the pie. What would be the there is no silver bullet possibly, but what would you stress as some of the sort of these are the priorities, and this is maybe less important. Is there?
I'm not the expert in that.
I don't think that the pie is fixed. This is what I think. And I think there's a lot of loss of efficiency still in the European Union. So the economy could be much bigger if it was managed more efficiently by policymakers. So if they were able to attract big firms to these economically inactive regions, this would be good for the region, but it would be also good for Europe overall. And I don't think we necessarily have to think of it that we take the firm away from Italy and put it into Hungary, but we may be able to establish an extra firm in Hungary, which increases the economic activity there. Of course, this has to go hand in hand with fiscal regulations, and but also we have to strengthen the wage bargaining power of workers all over Europe, not only in Germany, say, but also in Hungary. And we also have to increase the education levels so that they are more or less equivalent across countries, so that we don't only have educated workers in Germany, but that we also have them at the periphery, that we also have them in Spain, that we also have them in the East, I think.
Any question? Going back to some of the points we mentioned in the beginning about convergence, divergence as productivity, and then there is the one answer we could give to those workers in northeastern Hungary would be, well, you never converge, but don't worry because there is a compensating mechanism and you'll be fine. There'll be enough cohesion. And I'm thinking, what is the relationship, more broadly maybe, between wage convergence and social welfare convergence, possibly, or divergence, or is there should there be different approaches to different regions, or I don't know what. I mean, I'm just asking because we're thinking about convergence in terms of some kind of economic indicators like wages, let's say, but then unemployment or infrastructure, yes. But we already have this in Europe, welfare state, and my question would be, how should we see this? How should we conceptualize this wage convergence and social welfare convergence as well? Some kind of coordination, or what would be the way forward here?
I think this is an important issue because the political equilibrium is changing, in the sense that if you don't make it clear that the European Union is providing you with social welfare, people stop loving the European Union and start voting against it. So I think it's urgent to provide, to design a framework whereby you also make it clear that the European Union is providing you with, for example, the program for youth unemployment, the Youth Guarantee. Youth Guarantee is a program that helps the youth to find the first job. The Erasmus program, the EURES program, I don't know that maybe the pronunciation, whereby you work abroad. Erasmus is you study abroad. Youth Guarantee is funded by the European Union gives money to the public employment services to help you find the first job. All these things, like the use of European funds, like Andor explained to us before, all these things, they must be more explained. There must be more there must be more public attention on these things. Otherwise, Europe is seen as something outside, something external, something not convincing. Maybe it's more seen as a binding constraint rather than a means of increasing your welfare and your benefits. So I think that's urgent. So the European Social Union would be nice to have along with the European Monetary Union. that's also something that may be different across countries that need more convergence in terms of fundamentals because they have a common currency, and countries that do not want the common currency therefore may need less convergence from this point of view. But I think it's urgent to convince people that that Europe is a big social project, not only a monetary project. That's why I think on the welfare issues we need to be able to spend. Also because just this quick remark, governments most of the time, if they want to spend money, they spend it on pensions, they spend it on subsidies, they spend it on something that is politically rewarding. But most of the times, many things are not immediately politically rewarding, but they are much needed. So if you want to improve schools, when I was in government, outside my office, there was always sitting people that were protesting because they wanted more pensions. I never had anybody protesting because they want better schools or better universities or better infrastructure. No, it's not true. Those immediately protesting, they want more pensions usually, or they want more. They want something now. They don't want better schools in 10 years. Those you find it written on the newspapers, but not outside your office. It makes a big difference. And in fact, when you have to spend money, most of the time you spend it on emergencies. You don't spend it on big investment.
Thank you. Let's make this we are running.
Europe can be a big help on this point of view, because if Europe said, okay, I permit you to spend, I allow you to spend more money, but only if you spend it on schools, then it's a help, because it's a constraint that forces government to think longer and to look forward rather than look outside your office because there is somebody that asking for money now.
Andrea?
Andrea.
Would you want to respond to this welfare spending?
No, I think this is a very good point Marco was making, so that the EU subsidy program maybe should be reformed and should have a more social component and also be more targeted, so that they don't only give money to the government and say you know best how to spend it, but they put some conditions that they spend on some long-term investment or education or whatever. This is a very good point.
Thank you. László, some last remarks?
I can only agree with this, and I think the concept of a social union is very important. It's true that at the time of the crisis, in many countries, the impression was that the EU is a fiscal police. And then it's very easy. You can only be against if an international club of which you are a member only appears in such clothes. So it's at the same time this crisis experience conceals that the EU has had a lot of activities or initiatives in the social dimension, but it's not so prominent. And what we saw in the recent period is that there was a bit of a backtracking because in 2010 the EU set very ambitious targets in terms of increasing employment, in terms of reducing poverty, and if we are not delivering, then we shouldn't be so loud about this. So instead of looking for more resources, instead of trying to find the consistency between the policies, the reaction of quite a lot of policymakers also in Brussels was that let's just keep quiet on this social dimension. I think this is wrong. I think exactly the opposite would be needed. The opposite doesn't mean that the EU would become a welfare state, because the EU doesn't have the resources to be a welfare state. But the EU would need to provide some guarantee that the economic functioning of the EU is not detrimental to the national welfare states and the national democracy, but supportive. So if you connect the dots and if you add some critical elements, in my view, the unemployment insurance is also a critical element, just to ensure that if there is a big asymmetric shock, a rainy day, then you have something to step in a supportive fashion and not only with constraints. So if you can identify what these key components would be to be added to the existing construct, then it would strengthen economically, socially, as well as politically.
Fantastic. On this note, I conclude this panel and the lecture. Thank you so very much for all these insights, and we should continue the debate here in front of the room or in the other events. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.